Good morning, everyone. I see lots of people still coming in. Please don't be afraid to come closer to the stage. We're hoping that if there's enough body heat in the room, we'll raise the temperature. You might not know that you're in Florida when you sit in this room. Good morning, my name is Darla Spence-Coffey. I'm the President and CEO of the Council on Social Work Education, and it is a deep pleasure of mine to welcome you here to the Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecture. Thank you for coming this morning. This is one of our signature events here at the annual program meeting for CSWE, and I'm just really thrilled. There was a few years ago that we decided that we needed to create an opportunity through this lecture series to really acknowledge the good work that social work educators and leaders are doing across the country that really align with the values of Carl A. Scott. We had spent some time going out and paying other speakers that knew but didn't really know social work as well as we thought they should. And so the idea of just bringing this back home and honoring one of our own has just been really important. So thank you for joining us. You're in for a treat. I'm going to pass things off now to Dr. Kudar Snell. Dr. Snell is a faculty member at the Howard University School of Social Work, who is a sponsor for this event. So thank you to Howard, and also thank you to Dr. Snell. He's also serving as the Assistant Provost of International Programs at Howard University. So like many social work educators, he got tapped on the shoulder to provide university-wide leadership. And so we're really proud of him in that space as well. So here we go, Dr. Snell.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecture. I would like to recognize and also thank my Dean, Dr. Sandra E. Crew from Howard University School of Social Work, for her support and for sponsoring the Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecture on behalf of Howard University this year. Thank you, Dean Crew. We have an outstanding lecture planned for you this morning, but before we begin, I want to spend a few minutes introducing and in some ways reintroducing Carl A. Scott. Carl received a BA in psychology and MSW in 1954 from Howard University. After serving in various practice and administrative positions in children and family service agencies, Carl joined the New York University School of Social Work, where he served as Director of Admissions and Assistant Professor. Mr. Scott joined the Council on Social Work Education in 1968 as a senior consultant on minority groups when the main office was in New York City. He retired in 1985 as the Associate Executive Director. Carl developed CSWE's 2 minority fellowship programs in 1974 with funding from the National Institute of Mental Health. To date, well over 600 African American, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Puerto Ricans completed doctoral level social work study. Many of these fellowship recipients now serve as deans, directors, and faculty in social work programs throughout the nation. Carl was a superb academic, administrator, colleague, and mentor. He passed away in 1986, and in recognition of his contributions to CSWE and to the profession, the CSWE Board of Directors established the Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecture Fund in that same year. Carl Scott was at the helm of CSWE's early efforts to foster human diversity in social work education. He was a pioneer in obtaining scholarships for students from ethnic groups of color. Of special note are the Minority Fellowships Program for doctoral students to prepare mental health researchers and leaders in teaching and mental health services. The Carl A. Scott Memorial Fund was developed to continue the legacy of equity and social justice in social work through building knowledge and furthering the well-being of individuals and their communities. These were the goals to which Scott devoted his life's work. Since 1988, the fund has sponsored a lecture at the CSWE annual program meeting. The first 5 of these lectures edited by Dr. Dorothy Pearson, former professor at Howard University School of Social Work, comprise the contents of a volume entitled Perspectives on Equity and Justice. Dr. Aracelis Francis, retired from CSWE, for years served as liaison for the Memorial Fund. Dr. Geraldine Meeks followed Dr. Francis as director of the Minority Fellowship Programs. We'd also like to thank the current director, Dr. CSWE Nguyen, the associate director, Tabitha Beck, and thanks to Catherine Lord, who's the program associate for centers and initiatives for their assistance and support. Another activity of the Memorial Fund is the awarding of book scholarships to highly qualified social work students. The Carl Scott Book Scholarships provide 2 annual 500 book scholarships to bachelor or master social work students in the final year of their program who are committed to addressing issues of social justice. The Memorial Fund depends upon donations. We're not passing the hat this year. We usually pass the hat in former meetings. But we have staff, MFP staff at the back, so please see them as you go out. We would like you to make your donation today. Please consider that. It is my pleasure to announce the Carl A. Scott Book Scholarship awardees for this year. And if you are here, will you please stand? The winners are Amy Marie Kerrigan. Ms. Kerrigan is seeking a master's degree in social work from Columbia University School of Social Work in New York, and she would like to continue doing defense-based work in the criminal justice system after she graduates. Jose Canas. Mr. Canas is a senior in the Bachelor of Social Work program at Fayetteville State University in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He plans to attend state-certified mediation training so he can fully participate in client mediation. So congratulations to our 2 books scholarship winners. I chair the scholarship committee, but I don't review the applications. We have our committee members who do that, and so I'd like to recognize them. I see a few faces. I see a few of them here. Dr. Ruby Godin from Howard University School of Social Work. Dr. Sadie Logan, who's Professor Emeritus from the University of South Carolina. Dr. Gwinnell O'Neill from Westchester University. Dr. Edward Mullen, Professor Emeritus from Columbia University. Dr. Robert Ortega, I see, from the University of Michigan. He always comes. Dr. Geeta Mehrotra from Portland State University. Dr. Michelle Roundtree from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Crystal Coles from the University of Kansas. Dr. Carl Allgood is a Howard graduate from Bowie State University. Dr. Lisa Gray from Regis College, Dr. Johnny Kim from the University of Denver, Dr. Daniel Velez Ortiz from Michigan State University, Dr. Isok Kim from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and Dr. Alma O'Trinidad from Portland State University. Thank you. We also have past recipients of MFP, of the Minority Fellowship programs with us here. Can you stand so we can recognize you? You always come in a block, I remember. Yes? Thank you. Thank you so much. I would now like to call to the podium Dr. Jenny Jones. Dr. Jenny Jones is the Dean of the Whitney M. Young School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. She's also the chair of the Commission on Diversity, Social and Economic Justice. Dr. Jones.
Good morning. Good morning. All right, you're here. I am Jenny Jones, as Kudor said, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair for the Diversity and Social and Economic Justice Commission. I am very proud to have the opportunity this morning to introduce our lecturer, Dr. Karina Walters. But before I do that, let me just ask any members of the commission that are present to please stand and be recognized. Rebecca Moore, Noreen Mokua, Leah, and I can't see for the lights. I hope I'm not missing. Oh, yes, Tina in the very back. This commission is made up of all of the councils and several affiliate groups. And we spend a significant amount of time reviewing the applications for this lecturer because we don't take this very lightly. We believe that this is a very important charge, and the person that stands before you to deliver the message, we believe, needs to be reflective of the values and the work of Carl A. Scott. And so this morning, our lecturer, I am just thrilled over. You'll hear me use the word thrill several times, and as I go through introducing her, I'll tell you why. Let me give you a little bit about her background. Karina L. Walters, an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, is the Associate Dean for Research, the Catherine Hall Chambers Scholar, and the co-director and principal investigator of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. IWRI is one of 16 national institutes of minority health and health disparities comprehensive centers of excellence, and one of 2 devoted to American Indian and Alaska Native. In the country, Dr. Walter has served over 23 years of experience in social epidemiological research on the historical, social, and cultural determinants of health among AIAN populations, as well as chronic disease prevention research. She has presented at over 350 national and international conferences, was the first American Indian invited speaker for Wednesday afternoon lecture series at the NIH, and was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Dr. Walters has served as principal and co-investigator on over 44 National Institute of Health grants. 20, she served as PI. She bad. She bad. She is bad. She has personally mentored over 110 scholars from historically underrepresented populations, including 55 AIAN scholars, and has participated in 16 national research training programs for underrepresented ethnic minority scholars. As the originator of the indigenous stress coping model, she utilizes the framework as well as decolonizing methodologies and community-based participatory approaches throughout her research endeavors. She received her BA in sociology in 1987, her MSW degree in clinical work in 1990, and her PhD in 1995, all from the University of California, Los Angeles. She, after serving on faculty as an assistant and associate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work from 1995 to 2001, she joined the University of Washington as faculty in she joined the University of Washington faculty in 2001. Prior to her career in academia, Dr. Walters participated as a community-based psychotherapist and served as a commissioner for the Los Angeles City Council American Indian Commission. Now, I want to tell you how I met Karina Walters. This is her professional bio. I was a first-year doctoral student in 1998 attending CSWE in New York. And you know, when you're a first-year doctoral student, you don't really know what's going on. You're simply there. And Karina Walters came in to speak with us in the MFP. And she started talking about her experiences in her doctoral program and about developing this 5-year plan. And I kept saying, what the hell is a 5-year plan? I just got here. And so, And then she went on to tell us that when her professor told her that she had the same reaction. What is a 5-year plan? And so, and then she talked with us. This stuck with me throughout my time in this work. She started to talk to us about the term microaggressions. I'd never heard it, didn't know what it meant, but when she explained to us what that looks like in everyday life, that has stayed with me throughout my years of work. And so I want to say to you, my sister, thank you for sharing that information with us. You don't know what an impact it made on so many of us. We still talk about it today. Also, every time I've called you, you've always responded. I just thank you for your mentorship, your leadership, for all of the people that you work for. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Karina Walters.
You read that, I'm like, who the hell is she talking about? Oh, wow. Who's that she's talking about? I don't know. Well, halito sa hachifa hatapushi kan transpo chebeti hoyo michasa hachifa Karina Walters michachata si hoke yakoke okla Tumukwa Ais Utina Togobaga Kalusa Seminole Yokoke, the elders, the distinguished elders who are here, Dr. Jones, Dr. Snell, and my dean, Yohara, and others who are here. Thank you so much. And Dr. Jones, thank you for that incredible introduction. I wanted to extend my thanks to the people of this land. That's what I just did in Choctaw. I'd like to say I'm not a fluent speaker at all. I'm an adult learner. So I just wanted to acknowledge the land that we're on. And it's important to do that. And one thing I just also want to acknowledge, and the Seven Seas Lagoon that's here at Disney, you should know that it was built with 7 million tons of dredged earth that unfortunately carried indigenous remains from a nearby mound called Macy Mound. It's right here off of Bay Lake. It was before the Native American Graves Protection Act, and now when they do find bones, they are properly interred and cared for. But I just want to acknowledge that we indeed do stand in sacred territory. I also want to say how honored I am to be speaking in honor in this lecture with Carl Scott. He was an amazing social work leader, and I directly benefited from his vision. I was an MFP fellow myself, and I wouldn't be standing here if he hadn't literally developed that program, and I am so grateful to him. I also want to acknowledge his niece, Mary Boria, who actually contacted me when she found out that I was speaking to share a little bit more about Carl's background and experience. And in addition to being African American, Carl also is Choctaw. I know, that's what I was like. Yes, he actually, his family comes from an area in Alabama, literally it's known as Choctaw County, Alabama, and it's near a town called Mount Sterling. And that the historical name for that place actually is Bachachuca, which means Ridge House. And this was a place where historic council meetings and important meetings used to take place, and that's where he comes from. Pushmataha was a particular leader that signed a treaty, actually, right there in that area. So I am really honored on multiple levels and indebted to the work that he does, but also, you know, we may be cousins, so. So I'm excited about that. So I'm going to go ahead and, let's see, make sure I do this right. Oh, look, I can see that. Yes, you know what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I also want to acknowledge where we stand today. We actually stand near, just as I just acknowledged where Carl was from, we actually stand near the council oak tree. It's just north of here, near the Fort Gatlin Historic Site. And this is where Seminole leaders Osceola and others met to discuss their plans to resist forced relocation and removal from this territory. It's known historically in our language as Oka Tuchanachi, which means 3 times waters. It's where 3 lakes come together. It's also known as a place of fair waters. And I want to talk a little bit about that today because I want us to talk a little bit about water. And think about water. We're surrounded by it here. You know, waters are important for our well-being. Our body is made of it. Most of our world is made up of water. And to indigenous people, water is life. Water is our first medicine. We are born literally from our mother's waters. So in this way, water is indeed life, and it is medicine. So we stand in the territory of the place of waters, and we have the opportunity to share and provide sustenance to one another as we talk with this water. But let's think about water a little bit differently too. When you take that sip of water today, I want you to think a little bit about where did that water come from? Because what water does is it rises back up to the heavens only to return back to earth. In that way, the water that you bring to your lips is the same water that your ancestors brought to their lips. In that way, we're still connected to our ancestors every time we take a sip of water. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Also, in that way, we're also, just as the experiences our ancestors had, both good and bad, we too are still connected to those experiences. We're inextricably linked to the experiences that our ancestors had and carried. So I want us to think about that today a little bit, because I'm going to talk a little bit about historical trauma. And I want us to think a little bit about not focusing on so much the deprivation and struggle. We've talked a lot about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a turn that I took in my research and my experience in thinking about historical trauma, with sharing a little bit about my own Choctaw tribe and the work that we're doing there to move beyond it and to think about it. So when I talk about historical trauma, I don't want us to just sit only with the deprivation and the struggle of that, but rather, I want you to think about power, love, and vision. Because in this moment, it's a powerful place to be. In this moment, I am my great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter's ancestor. In this moment, I am my great-great-great-great-grandmother's granddaughter. In this moment, I'm all of those things. So if I take action for my health and my well-being in this moment, I'm not only affecting my own well-being and my immediate family or my community, but I'm actually impacting the next 7 generations or so. In this moment, when I take care of myself, I actually have the opportunity to repair or take care of whatever I still carry that my ancestors didn't have an opportunity to take care of. That's not a place of disempowerment. That's a place of power. And so when we talk about historical trauma and those things that we carry still to this day, it's a place of power. I also want to talk about vision, because our ancestors didn't go through what they went through without having a vision of life and love for us. And our obligation is to get reconnected to that vision of life and love as we move forward. So they actually had a vision that we need to honor and respect. And out of that vision, and what drove that vision, was love. So when we talk about historical trauma today, I'm actually talking about love. And I think that's an important reframe when we talk about some of these events that impacted our lives. So it's the love that they carried for us. In my tribe, we have a story that ancient times, long time ago, one of our origin stories says that there were 2 brothers, Choctaw and Chickasaw, who it was a great upheaval, and so they had to remove everybody and walk a long distance, and that's how we ended up in Nanawaya in Mississippi. And they loved us so much, and I'm going to say us because we're still connected. They loved us so much that they packed up all of the bones of our ancestors and took them with us. That's how important that relationship is. And I know from working the work we're doing in my tribe right now around the Trail of Tears and historical trauma, I know of stories where people actually, on the removal, before removal, ground bones and sewed it into the hems of their skirts. Some of the mothers did that so that they made sure that their ancestors went with them. That's how much and how powerful our love is, but that's also how connected we are over generations. So I want us to think a little bit about that today. So we should not be defined, this is important too, we're not defined by historical trauma. We're defined by the vision and the original instructions, the original teachings that our ancestors carried for us and passed down to us. We're defined by our people. We're not defined by traumatic events. And I think that's another important piece as I talk about this. So it's not about a place of victimization. It's not about a place of staying in that mindset, because our colonial folks would love that. It's really about survivance and thrivance and moving forward in a beautiful way, connecting to that power, love, and vision. So let's think a little bit about that as we talk about that today. This is Osceola. That's his picture on the left there, that I think it's on your right. And he's the one who is from this area. And Osceola, actually, it means Ossi is the drink. It's our medicine drink. And Yahola means singer. So he was not only a great leader, but he was also a singer for the medicine during ceremonies. A little bit about where I come from. My ancestors, since we talk about Carl's and I'm talking about the ancestors of this land, I also am inviting my own ancestors to be with us today. And Choctaws, actually, we're in the northwestern panhandle part of Florida as well. So this is part of a territory that we're familiar with. And the Seminoles are mostly Creek relatives. That we consider them our big brothers. So we're familiar with all of these areas. And we used to be urban Indians back in the day. It's a joke, guys. Cahokia, this is a picture of Cahokia. About 40,000 to 50,000 Native people live there, so I'm not kidding. We really did have huge urban infrastructure. So whenever people say, talk about urban Indians as if it's a new phenomenon, I'm like, no, we've been urban before. We've had big cities. So we descend from the mound-building people, mostly from this area, all the way up through to the Great Lakes, actually. This is Nanewaya, which I talked about a little bit earlier, and these are some of my ancestors. I also want to acknowledge the ones that just came up. These are my Florida indigenous ancestors who are, so I remember them as we talk today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about historical trauma and the work that has evolved over the years. And I'm going to share it through the elements, because I think this is the best way to kind of talk about this. I'm going to talk about water, which we already did. And we think about that, I am the water is me, and this way we're connected across generations. Land, I am the land is me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how historical trauma is definitely tied to land and place and our well-being. I'm going to talk a little bit about air and wind, the transformative power of what we have before us in terms of moving forward in a beautiful way. And I want to talk a little bit about fire. For us, and you're standing in the territory of the southeastern tribes, for us, fire is life. For us, as long as we keep fire burning, because fire is a representation of Creator on earth, as long as that fire is lit and the fire that remains in our children's heart is still burning, we live as a people. So fire is critical. So let's talk a little bit more about water. The first poem that was translated from English into Choctaw became a proverb in our tribe over time. And it's interesting that this is the one that was chosen, because the translation in terms of the proverb is, "The breeze that ruffles the stream knows not the depth below." And if I think about that in terms of historical trauma, little do people really know the depth of the beauty and everything else that is there. It's just a breeze that ruffles the stream. So the guiding principle of most of my work has been, how do traumatic stressors and events literally become embodied? How do they take up into our bodies, and how do they manifest in our risk behaviors? Dr. Jones talked a little bit about the stress coping model, and so this is just a little bit of the background on it, looking at historically traumatic events, and what kind of impact these kinds of events have on our well-being, but also microaggressions, those everyday discriminatory events, chronic stress, things like that that have an impact on us. But what's important in thinking about how do these stressors impact our well-being is what is protecting us? What is buffering the impact of these events on our well-being? Family, culture, language, sense of place, sense of belonging, all of those issues help to buffer the impact of these kinds of events on our well-being. And when I talk about well-being today, I'm not talking about only mental health or physical health or bodily health. I'm talking about the whole way it's all connected. And that includes land health, because these things are all connected. And that's my daughter. I had to throw her in there, of course. That's for those of you who are the, us indigenous geeks out there who want to know how that looks in a model that you would see in a journal. So there you go. The way I presented it is how I normally talk about it in community. Now that's my research side. So one of the things about this embodiment perspective and thinking about that is, I draw from Nancy Krieger's work. How do bones and bodies tell stories? And we know from research that literally our bodies do share stories. They tell stories about stress. They tell stories about PTSD, which tends to sit right here. So our bodies literally tell stories. And even the experiences our ancestors carried and they still can be actually told through our bodies. And there's some really interesting epigenetic research that's starting to show the intergenerational transmission of that stress process and impact on cellular, literally at the cellular level of our well-being. Okay, so a little bit turning to some of the aspects of land. Before I talk about historical trauma, I need to set a context about historical trauma, and that's settler colonialism, specifically US settler colonialism, okay? So settler colonialism in the United States is actually a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty and actually creates origin myths so that they can continue to have a story that sounds good and positive. And to do that, you have to erase indigenous people from the conversation. That's the reason why most Americans, most people who are brought up in the US system here really don't know Native history very well, or African American history, or other histories for that matter. But the point of that settler colonialism is that it normalizes continuous settler occupation, it normalizes exploitation of land and resources to which indigenous people continue to have these genealogical relationships, okay? So a good example of this, and the last piece of this I want to say is, settler colonialism is a structure. Historically traumatic events are events. These events help to uphold the structure. So I think that's a very important element that's been missing, I think, from really, and I think I've taken it for granted in a lot of my work, that I'm like, oh yeah, colonization, and I think we all understand, and I'm like, no, people don't really understand that what settler colonialism really looks like. It wants to erase indigenous people. Not metaphorically, I mean, not only through genocidal policies of historically, but actually even from being present in the everyday world today. And that's actually one of the stressors that we always have to deal with, because we have to claim ourselves constantly. So Eve Tuck says, and I like this quote, "Everything within a settler colonial society strains to destroy or assimilate the native in order to disappear them from the land. This is how a society can have multiple simultaneous and conflicting messages about indigenous peoples, such as all Indians are dead, located in faraway reservations, that contemporary indigenous people are less indigenous than prior generations, and that all Americans are just a little bit Indian." Okay. Think about that. So I want to give you an example of how it gets manifest in these strange ways. So if you read the history books about our first contact with Native people, for Choctaws anyways, it was DeSoto. That's a longer story I could tell you about later. But what anthropologists talk about, and they've done their research, is that we talked about them as white God, a white God that came, white people that we kind of treated them initially well before they tried to massacre us, right? And there's a very strange myth about that there's somehow that this is a white God that came in. Well, let me tell you what it is and how the anthropologists got it wrong. So this is part of what's the erasure and retelling of a story to support a certain origin experience, right? We welcome them in, so somehow we're responsible for our own demise, right? So what we called the invaders when they first came in, and literally we called them Naholo. And so they said, well, what is Naholo? And we told them, oh, it's a spirit. So they took that to mean God, and they took that to mean a positive spirit. So let me tell you what Oka Naholo is. And I think our ancestors were really brilliant when I think about this. So, Oka Naholo is a spirit that is white, and it actually looks like a serpent that lives in the water. It's a serpent spirit that actually lives in the water. And what Oka Naholo tries to do is calls to you to come to the river edge. You find them around whirlpools especially. Calls to you to look at your own reflection and gaze at yourself and get enamored of yourself. And what it does is it comes up and it grabs you and devours you and turns you into one of them. Wow. That was Naholo. I'm just saying. So our ancestors have some teachings that they can pass on to us to be mindful of, right? Language is very powerful when you start to break it down. Anyway, so the anthropologists, of course, got it wrong. But the point is, it was to create a story. And it was a way of creating our indigeneity as a way to support their point of view to be able to justify occupying land and resources and dispossession. So I want you to think about that as we talk about historical trauma. The other thing is I just want to acknowledge what do I mean by that. These are events that are targeted to a collective, to a people, and the intention is genocide and ethnocide, which is a form of genocide. The systematic destruction of culture and lifeways. That is the intent. It's not benign. It's not an event that just accidentally happens, right? It's not a weather event on the community. It's a human-driven event that causes incredible collective upheaval. I also want to acknowledge that even when these events happen, though, the majority of people are amazingly resilient, and the majority of people don't thrive. They move through the event. But I also want to acknowledge that these events don't tend to be singular. They tend to be rolling events that happen over generations or through, because these are groups that are targeted. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trail of Tears. I got a pointer. Let me see if that works. Oh, look at that. So these are our traditional homelands, actually, all down here, even down into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, this whole, right here, Choctaw. And then by the time we had treaties in the time of removal, we were pushed into this area. And then in 1830, now we were the first to be removed of the removal policy under Andrew Jackson. So Cherokee get all the credit, but really we were the first. We moved from here, and we were forcibly walked, basically, and by some steamboats as well, moved across and walked into this territory. This is now our territory. Do you know we're bigger? Our territory is bigger than the state of Massachusetts? Yeah, most people don't know that. So the historically traumatic event, to give you an example of what these events are, I think the boarding school experience captures it really well. It also still has contemporary effects on our people that are still manifest today. And just to give you a quick background, boarding schools were established in around 1879, 1880 with the intent of ethnocide and genocide. The idea was to kill the Indian to save the man, as Pratt, who was in charge of Indian education. You need to know that Pratt formerly was involved in, was the head of American Indian prisoners at Fort Marion Prison, and that's who they put in charge of Indian education. So Indian education at this time was under the Department of War. It was not, under really with the intent of education. So they forcibly removed hundreds of thousands of our children and placed them into boarding schools, cut their hair, wouldn't allow them to speak their language, punished them, in some cases severe physical and sexual abuse in these schools. And on average, they were kept away from their families a minimum of 7 years. And a lot of children, unfortunately, perished in this experience as well. And you can see how young they are. This is Carlisle Indian School. Very young. So this is an example. This is Tom Torino when he first arrived at Carlisle. He's a Navajo young man. This is him 3 years later. How many of you saw rabbit-proof fence? If you haven't seen that, you should see that. In Australia, similar process. They learned it from us, yes. The other impact on these boarding schools, when you're separated from your culture and you're not allowed to speak your language, you're not allowed to have this information, they also forced Christianity. There was enforced Christianity on folks, so there was a replacement of religious practices. There was also an outlawing of our religious and customary practices during that period. If you're found anywhere in the communities practicing your religion or your culture, you could be put into prison for up to 6 months. So, or your food rations would be withheld from the community. So this was not long ago, guys. This is in the generation of my grandparents and great-grandparents, so not long ago. But one of the big impact is replacing, for matriarchal matrilineal cultures, replacing patriarchy in these structures. And I wanted to acknowledge that because my tribe was traditionally matriarchal matrilineal. And here's green corn. I have corn, so reminding that when women were in charge of our green corn and the green corn ceremonies, that's when we had our power, because our power was tied to that ceremonial life and structure. And basically that got disrupted through the historical trauma events. The other thing I want to acknowledge, that historical trauma events aren't just based on events to people. These are buffalo skulls. So the targeting of killing of animals or taking of land or dispossession of land, that's all part of the historical trauma spectrum, so I want to share that. This is important because General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Dakota and the Lakota and Nakota people was by killing the buffalo. Now this is where people get a little confused about that because they think, oh, that's interrupting their food source. It's much deeper than that. What it's designed to do is disrupt people's ability to fulfill their original instructions. It's a deeper spiritual assault. So what is the impact of historical trauma? And this is like kind of giving you my summary in a short period. It's rooted in genocide, ethnocide, epistemicide. So even the systematic destruction of thought ways, how we think and view the world through things like the boarding school experience, right? It disrupts our ability to fulfill our original instructions. It disrupts our relational ways of being, right? Our relationship to our ancestors, those stories, relationship to our land, relationship to our bodies. It's all relational. That is what settler colonialism is intended to do, disrupt our relational way of being. It breaks down our system of borders and understanding our boundaries, our physical, mental, spiritual boundaries. And actually it's designed to create systems of dependency on others to define us and systems to define us. And it can manifest in things like all of a sudden, you know, if a Native client walks in and they've been struggling living with depression for a while and they've been in a client, and we see this with other clients too, right? They've been in the system long enough. You ask them, you know, tell me a little bit about yourself. They say, I'm depressed. And then I remember Eduardo Duran said, you know, this is what he did with one client. He said, oh, so tell me, how did you get that ceremonial name depressed? And the client's like, what? I didn't, my name's Joe. And he's like, no, you let me know your sacred name, depressed. So how'd you get that? Tell me about that naming ceremony. And they're like, what naming ceremony? He goes, you know, where, you know, your holy people, they get together. Sometimes they wear suits, sometimes they wear, you know, white coats. And they come in this room and they all have this council. They have this important meeting. And they all discuss and they have this sacred text that they bring out. And they open up the sacred text. It's called the DSM. And they point to that text and they go, oh, his name shall be depressed. So that ceremony, tell me about that. The client's like, what? And why is that important? So this is a thing about rethinking our relational way of thinking, right? Getting our thinking back, which is, you know, the client's, well, no, that's not my name. He's like, well, naming ceremonies are really important. Naming ceremonies tell us how to behave in the world. They also tell the community how to receive us and how to treat us. They tell us our obligations to that name. So if you don't understand why you just received that name depression or depressed, you should understand that relationship. Then he'll shift it. He'll say, well, when does depression visit you? Visit you. So now you have a relationship to depression. You're not defined You're not depressed, but you have a relationship to depression. So restoring that relational thinking. You know, does it visit you at 3 o'clock in the morning? Wake up, time to get up. Got some bad thoughts for you right now. So if you have a relationship to depression, if you have a relational way of thinking about it, what can you do? You can break up. You can say, I'm done. I am now no longer going to accept you. Okay, so that's a relational way of thinking. And that's an example of how some of our practitioners restore that relational way of practice in moving forward. So why don't you think about that? Now, I talk about all this historical trauma, but actually I've done research. And we have evidence that it does have an impact on our well-being, and I'm just going to give you just a little snapshot. One of the big critics, even other Native folks who critique historical trauma research, they're like, maybe something that happened 5 generations ago or 7 generations ago or 3 generations ago doesn't really matter. What trumps everything is what happened in your lifetime. So maybe it's the sexual assault you had in your lifetime that really needs to be paid attention to, and not all of this business from generations ago. And I would say, well, that's actually kind of a red herring. We don't need to split this off, but actually we have to deal with the messiness and the complexity of what these intergenerational impacts are, and look at real life, contemporary, from structural all the way down to individual levels of issues that people have had to navigate and negotiate. So these things makes it complicated. So what can we do statistically and try to deal with that? What we did was we basically said, okay, well, let's control for, statistically, one's lifetime experience of trauma. Let's control for, statistically, one's sexual assault history. Let's control for military combat exposure, because that would also be related to PTSD and depression, right? Let's control for all of those things. Let's even control for your own exposure to historically traumatic events that happened maybe in your lifetime. Let's control. And then let's see if we still have an impact of what happened to your self-report, of what happened to your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, still if it has an impact on your depression and post-traumatic stress symptoms. And guess what? We found out it did. It still did. So I'm working on publishing this right now. So you can say, it's not published this part yet, but it's coming. So this just gives you an idea. So the idea was that the more chronic your historical trauma exposure was to your ancestors, the more likely you're dealing with some depression you're more vulnerable to depression in this lifetime. Not surprising, right? So, okay, I got the data. There you go. But I needed a paradigm shift. And I want to tell you a little bit about what happened when I started thinking about it. And it happened in part because I got called by my tribe to do some work around historical trauma. And I kind of had a spiritual moment, but I'll get to that. So let me walk you through the paradigm shift, and this comes from a Native Hawaiian elder who talked about this, and I had one of those aha moments. You know crabs in the bucket? You know that story, we talk about that as lateral violence. Like if someone tries to crawl up out of the bucket, because this is what fishermen do, they put crabs in the bucket. The crab tries to crawl out, the other crabs bring it down. So we're saying, oh, you were like crabs in the bucket, always like, you know, not boosting each other up. And you know me, I'd be a social worker, I'd be all in there, come on, crabs, we could do it. You know? Let's lift each other. We don't have to bring each other down. I'd be like, are you depressed? Is that what's happening? Did someone name you depressed? No. So I'd be all talking to the other crabs, and we'd be trying to help each other out. So. But let's think about that for a minute. We just accept this is crab behavior, right? So let me ask you, do crabs live in a bucket? Crabs don't live in a bucket. How did we accept the bucket? What's normal crab behavior? Normal crab behavior is when they are not in a bucket and they are in their natural environment, they actually help each other up on rocks. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't a few crabs that are bad. There's going to be a couple of them there that might knock someone off, be a little territorial or something. But crab behavior in its natural way is a helpful behavior. That is actual natural crab behavior. So I realized I accepted the bucket. And that on some level, I was functioning with the reality of the bucket, and I had to live with historical trauma as my bucket. And I had to shift that. And I had a moment where I thought, oh, I need to get to what is our real natural behavior? Who are we? And that gets back to our original instructions. Who are we meant to always be? So crabs in a bucket. Makes you think about it. I also realized I had to rethink our whole approach to how do we do intervention. So our communities were like, yeah, historical trauma, we know that. Now what? How do we put this into action? What do we do differently? So I like this quote. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we or they used when they created them. Yeah, Albert Einstein said that. Thank you, Albert. So I started looking at interventions, and there's issues with empirically based approaches when they are not connected to the epistemologies, worldviews, and experiences of our own people, and when they're wholesale imported into our community, and then we're told these are empirically based, but I'm like, but not for our people, and I'm not sure that I want to buy into some of the worldviews that are tied to it, or I only want to be able to figure out which tools would be helpful under those conditions that my people might want to accept and be able to put forward, right? And a good example is what we see too often is, what I call tagging a feather approach, Grossman says, you can't just take Western structures of knowledge and add indigenous and stir. And now we got an indigenous model. There actually needs to be an equalization of power with indigenous knowledges and these Western approaches. And I'm not saying throw the Western approaches out. I'm saying it's just that it needs to come from the power of our knowledges to work with and decide what aspect of those approaches we want to take in and what aspects we want to say that does not work for us. So that, otherwise, if we just accept a tagging a feather approach, it locks us into certain ways of thinking that actually subordinates, makes subordinate our indigenous knowledges and practices, whether we realize it or not. So I started thinking more that we really need to build straight from the ground up in our own community. And when you start talking about that with sometimes to non-native researchers, a lot of anxieties start to arise because now I'm messing around with Western thinking about some of this stuff. And people try to reconcile that anxiety by diminishing indigenous ways of thinking or just saying, oh, that's nice, that's lovely. But let's really just do a cognitive behavioral therapeutic approach here. And it's like, no, let's really tackle this. Let's really look at this. I mean, our elders, what would have my grandma had done long time ago if someone came in to bring in some good new tools into the community? And we shared tools all the time. We had other people from other tribes come in, other cultures come in, but they would have said, oh, I'll take that one. That looks good. No, not that one. It's the power to be able to define that. And it's a relationship to these tools that matter. You can be a witch or a healer depending on how you relate to those tools. So the tools themselves aren't evil, but how we use them and how we thoughtfully relate to them does matter. And I've used Western tools. I did quantitative read. You just saw what I did. Okay. All right. So part of this is decolonizing and indigenizing approaches and the importance of that. It's not enough just to indigenize something. Right? Again, like I just talked about, but we also have to decolonize. And that means unsettling and getting, addressing and dismantling internalized colonizing processes that sometimes permeates our everyday life world, our thought ways, but also even how we structure our research and think about our research. So now I'm turning to FIRE, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that project that inspired the shift. This is the the Choctaw Road to Health. It's currently an NIDA-funded project, and I'm acknowledging my Choctaw relatives here we're co-partners in this. I also acknowledge a number of social workers who've been involved directly in this project as well. Dr. Katie Schultz, Dr. Ramona Beltran was part of the initial pilot phase of this, Dr. Donica Brown, who just got her dissertation completed off the data from this, so from part of this work. And this is Sandy Stroud and Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings. Michelle is Choctaw and also a co-principal investigator on this with me. And Sandy Stroud is our project director. So a number of years ago, there's my tribe, and this is our land base. It's still, we still use traditional names for our territory. And I think that's important to acknowledge. You don't usually see this on maps, right? It's bigger than the state of Massachusetts. There's our land right now. And in 2011, I was approached by the Choctaw Nation Health Services Director, Mickey Piercy, and he said, what can you do to help us? And I was excited because it was the first time I can actually help my own tribal community. And I said, well, what's going on? What do you need help with? And he said, well, we got a really big problem with obesity and diabetes, and we're on a speeding train in a bad way. And I said, well, how bad is it? He said 70% of our population is obese. 1 out of 3 of our children by 2050 will have type 2 diabetes, is what we're looking at. And he said, and we've spent millions of dollars to try to make a difference and stop this, from behavioral interventions all the way up through structural interventions, changing menus at the tribal level and putting in walkways. I mean, literally structural all the way down to behavioral. And what really got me was when he said, for the first time, I'm looking at parents and grandparents outliving their children. And we need to do something about that. So I actually felt pretty overwhelmed because empirically they were doing all the right things. They were doing all of the behavioral health things. They were doing all the way up to the structural things, but seeing less than 3% change at that point. Millions of dollars. And I said, well, what do you think is happening? He said, I think there's a sadness or a grief or that something's happening that 70% of the people who never access services are still not coming in the door. So when we've done these interventions, the 30% of the people that always show up at clinic are getting better. That's the 70% that's driving the population health disaster that isn't. What do we do? How can we get connected to do something different? I want to do something more culturally based. And that was our charge. He said, so can you help us? And I was like, I don't know. I said, let me pray about it. That was my reaction. It wasn't like, let me go do a lit review. Let me pray about it, because I really believe that the answer was deeper than they were doing all the things correctly by the Western models and approaches. And I didn't get very far when the answer came to me that simply, which is our ancestors did not die on that trail of tears or survive that trail of tears for us to be dying the way we are now. That was not their vision of life and love for us. They did not go through that for this vision for us. And that's when I started to realize we need to reconnect to that vision of love and life and develop interventions based on that was critical. Sharon Fleming was the chief sister who was alive at the time, who also said, we need to do something with the Trail of Tears. I don't know what, but we need to do something with Native women's health around that. So Sharon and I got together and we started puzzling what can we do to make this move in the right direction. And we actually went, and Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings brought her in at that point too. And we actually went back to the tribe, and I remember meeting in this little HUD trailer, meeting with them, and said, okay, we have an idea. What we would like to do to get reconnected to the vision of life and love is to develop our own Choctaw-specific health promotion model. We actually have to develop our own model. And the way we propose to do it is we want to rewalk the Trail of Tears. And I thought they would say, get the heck out of here. That is just too wacky. We can't do that. And our idea wasn't to get into the drama of the trauma, but to rewalk that Trail of Tears with prayers and thoughts each and every day to say, what can we learn? What are our original teachings today about medicine? And so then Mickey got excited. He said, oh, that's great. You can go out and think about suicide prevention and substance abuse prevention and, all of this prevention. And I said, no. We have to decolonize our own thinking about this. I said, it's not about that. It's about, instead of substance abuse prevention, what we want to think about is, what are our original teachings about medicines? And when we disrespect medicines, what happens to us? Instead of suicide prevention, what are our original teachings about life and living? And if we slip from that, how do we take corrective action? That's the approach that we need to take in walking each and every day. And it was important to all of us to walk in the footsteps, literally in the footsteps of our ancestors. So we created protocols and things to do that. Now here's the other piece to it. We said we don't want it to be service focused. It's not about building services. And they're like, what? Because so much has now, because of our capitalist system and other kinds of systems, everything's tied to services. I said, we have great services. Let's continue to have those services, but we need something different. We can't have culture in our we don't go to the clinic, which is turning out to be this way, to do our cultural activities. There should be cultural activities at the clinic, but that shouldn't drive our systems of culture and expression and experience. So we said we want to do something that's sustainable, something that is about shifting the way we live and breathe and experience the world in our community. Something that doesn't cost money, but costs our energy and commitment to meeting the medicine halfway. That we as Choctaw people step forward and want to do this. And you know what? They said, okay, go, do it. We're like, whoa, okay. And I thought he was going to say, Sharon, go do it. And he said, no, Karina, you and Sharon work together. You go do it. And you got to do it in the summer. You're going to rewalk this trail in the summer. I'm like, what? My test. It was a test. You're going to rewalk the trail. Do you all know what Arkansas is like in mid-June? I did not know how swampy Arkansas is. It is very swampy. So that was what we did. We intended to develop our own Choctaw-specific health promotion model. And again, decolonizing, indigenizing research approach. It's not about connecting to the trauma, but rather connecting to the vision of love and life each and every day. We walked 10 days. Now, if we had really rewalked the whole trail, it would have been 6 months. That was not going to happen. But what we wanted to do was walk on the intact parts of the trail that we could find. So we did GIS mapping. We did archival research. I went to the Smithsonian. I actually held the papers in my hand of our removal papers, which was really that was really intense. Actually, the removal, when you read the journals, the military journals from this, it's worse than I had even thought, because they're first-hand accounts of what was happening. So we went and did all of that to get the information. We actually didn't care if it crossed the middle of the freeway. Actually, part of the trail goes right through the University of Arkansas. We wanted to find it. And it was interesting, you know, Arkansas historians and some anthropologists didn't want to give us the information. They wanted to give us the route that's published online, the approximate route. And I'm like, no, I want the actual route. They were afraid we were going to go dig things up. Oh, well, we probably would have. But anyway, so. But we did butt heads with a few folks, but we did find some great people who helped us. And so the idea was to go 10 days in June, each day, opening up with prayer, walking in the same amount of miles on average our ancestors walked. So you have to remember, see, think about it this way. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we are Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma because we are all the survivors of the Trail of Tears. We're all the descendants of the people who survived the trail. Choctaws of Mississippi are the ones who stayed. They had their own trauma to deal with. But we're the ones who, that's our history. Okay, so we did the mapping, we got it ready, we looked at archival research, we planned to do qualitative data gathering, and this was a different approach, right? So I became research as well as research. I became a subject as much as I was a participant in my own project because I put myself into that trail and into that experience. We didn't know who was going to volunteer to be a part of this at that point. And but one of the things is we wanted to connect to that vision our ancestors held for us. And we found this quote, and I think this is Chief Harkins, he said this, he called it the farewell letter to the American people. And he said, I could cheerfully hope that those Choctaws of another age and generation may not feel the effects of those oppressive measures that have been so illiberally dealt to us, and that peace and happiness may be their reward. Amid the gloom and horrors of the present separation, we are cheered with the hope that nothing short of the basest acts of treachery will ever be able to wrest it from us, and that we may live free. So that's what our elders were telling us back then. We also met together and we said, well, to engage this journey together, and we're combining, and this is a very unique project. It's all Choctaw-led. From the researchers to the community, everybody is Choctaw. And this is very exciting to be a part of that project. But we decided, even though we're Choctaw, we're researchers coming in, and Michelle's from that area. I'm from Hollywood, so that's a whole other story. And so we decided we needed to create some principles to start with, principles of how we're going to engage each other as Choctaws in doing this work. And so we literally went back to the language, we talked to some elders, we found out these are some of the principles we want to live by to get started. And give you an idea of why it's so important. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. But language is really critical. So we started out, it's also community-based participatory practice research. I had a colleague say, well, actually it's really ceremonial-based practice research, new version of CBPR, because ceremony is part of it. And we started with a very basic question. What is the Choctaw road to health? How do we get there? And these are the pictures I'm sharing with you are all from the trail, by the way. And what ended up emerging was women-led people who came forward. And we were actually first worried, why are we only getting mostly women who want to do this? And our elders told us, that's fine. So what happened when we did this in-depth community research is that the community started sharing stories that helped us contextualize this from a cultural point of view. And they said, of course women are going to step into this first. And of course we should start with the women, because that's who our people are. And traditionally, it was the women who were responsible for the ceremonies of reconciling and bringing back and making things right again when a great upheaval happens. That was our role. And so they said, so of course you have women-led. Of course that's why women are coming forward. And what was really neat, it was women in behavioral health, Native women in behavioral health, Choctaw women who said, if we're going to ask our people to do this, I need to do it first. I need to get my weight, my body moving in a direction that's healthful. So I will step forward. And can I bring my kid along? And we said, sure, because there were kids on the trail, but they could only be over age 12, because let me tell you the IRB nightmare of walking the Trail of Tears. And the reason why they had to be 12 or older is they had to be able to survive and have the right weight and height to survive a water moccasin or a rattlesnake bite. That's what we were dealing with. But, you know, it was our tribe that said, you need to add chiggers, and you need to add, you know, ticks, and you need to add these things to your IRB too. And I'm like, really? The mosquitoes? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Let me tell you. We gave flesh offerings to our ancestors on this trail, because we went at the season when all that blooms. It was before it got too hot. It was hot, but it was right at the season when all the babies were all released in the air. Did you know chiggers do have a purpose? These are the things that we thought about on the trail. We said, what did our ancestors call chiggers? They had a name, and they actually eat mosquito eggs, so we were happy about that. But anyways, okay. So researchers were participants. We did triangulated research, and we actually included dreams. We included journaling. We included doing focus groups on the trail. All of this to try to think about what is a Choctaw-specific health promotion model going to look like as it emerges out of this data. And we did the oral history and the archival research. So I said how language is important. So we went back, for example, you know, you say translation, back translation, you know, all that. This is just an example of why it's so critical. So typically, if you do research in Indian country and you want a language issue, they'll send you to the language department. The language department will say, oh, the word you want is haklo. That means to listen. And I'm like, well, what does it really mean? Like, break it down. They're like, oh, it means to listen. Okay. So then we took that word back to a first language Choctaw speaker, an elder, Dorothy Mashaya, and we asked her, what does haklo mean? And she said, and these are her words. She goes, well, what haklo means is what is said may be very important to your life. Listen, haklo is to remember that the medicine given to us is still out there. We have just forgotten to listen for it. It is to be at peace with oneself, to be quiet and soft in spirit, to stop trying to outspeak others, to hear and communicate, to understand. It's about sharing from the spirit and taking the time to honor another human being. That's haklo. That's critical. You got to get to the first language when you're working with our communities, because that changes everything. We actually approached the trail in ceremony. We met with elders and said, how should we prepare for this? And our elders were great. They said, hey, listen, remember, our medicine people also already went through that trail. They took care of a lot of people along the way. So don't get caught up in the drama there. But you should still protect yourself. So they said, don't forget, that trail also is a Civil War trail. It's a slave trail. So you're going to be encountering all kinds of people along the way. So just, pray and be ready for it. So we literally, and actually, can you imagine doing this with a team, right? I asked our Choctaw people who are doc students, and we had we had Native people who are also not Choctaw who participated, who are indigenous, as witness, bearing witness. We wanted documentation in their experience about what they are experiencing with us so we could document that on the trail. So we had 13 people step forward who are Choctaw, and we had 5 other indigenous people who were there with us bearing witness, including an international indigenous colleague. And then we had 2 white people who also were there in support and there with us as well. And so I asked everybody, I said, you need to abstain from alcohol, drugs, or whatever for a month at least before we started on this trail. And they're like, really? So yeah, you do. Because we need to clean ourselves and prepare ourselves for what we're doing. And we all committed to that. So the idea was we are going onto the trail not to just sacrifice ourselves, but really, and we're not trying to recreate our experience of our ancestors. That would be disrespectful and it's not right. It's dishonoring. But what we're connecting to is that life and love. And each morning, remind ourselves it's not about the drama, but about the love. And it doesn't mean that tears didn't arise and that we didn't have some shared trauma that was connected in that way, but that we were focused on that relationship. We did GIS, we did blogging. We actually blogged so other people in the tribe and other people could follow us so they could be part of the experience. We were given pedometers and journals and stories and cameras and a whole bunch of things. We created a preliminary curriculum that we wanted to test on that. And I want to tell you, I will never ask someone to journal again after that experience. I was the worst participant ever. I did not journal. So I did not follow my own instructions. And I could just tell you, we did do focus groups on the trail. That data is very interesting. In terms of you hear us on the trail, we sound pretty wacky. So I would not recommend doing focus groups on a trail. But we did do pre and post qualitative interviews with people to say, what are your experiences? What are you anticipating this to be like? And then what happened for you? And that was actually very powerful. And we looked at both Native people who are Choctaw as well as non-Choctaws. So here's the trail, walking for the vision. We started out in our own territory. It was interesting. So this is part of what unraveled and became clear to us, is we used to think, oh, we had this kind of fantasy of wanting to be in Mississippi and starting there. And we said, no, in doing this work, we want to start where we are. This is our home base. This is who we are now. Here's some of the parent-child pairs that went on the trail. That's the trail itself. That's actually from the thousands of footsteps of feet, not just our own tribe, but the other southeastern tribes walk this part of the trail as well, in northern part of Arkansas. So that indentation is from the walk. It's not a natural indentation. So we rose every morning. A trail, we had a song that we started with to start the trail. Our ancestors sang to us when we crossed the Mississippi. And they sang, you know, Hina ushi pisali bokchito onali ya yali. And what they're saying is, I cry for you. I cry for you as you cross that great water. I cry for you. And that's the only part of the song that we had. And we prayed and we were hoping that we'd get to complete the song. Because normally our songs have four rounds. And we wanted it, but we didn't know if it was going to happen. See, this is what's different than how we're taught about research. From an indigenous perspective, knowledge is earned. It's not for the taking. You can put everything you want out there. It may not come to you because you're not ready for it yet. So we knew that. So we were hoping that maybe that knowledge would come to us, and that's what we were hoping with developing this model in this way. We knew we might not come back with much, or that maybe if we had earned it properly, something would come we were ready for. So anyway, we got the last 3 lines of that song. We were able to complete it on the last 3 days of the walk. And you know who helped us with that? The children, the young people who walked. They came up with it. They helped with it. We encountered microaggressions along the way on the trail. You walk through Arkansas. You camp out in Arkansas. There was one place I said to my colleague, Carrie, I said, that lady's giving us the stink eye. She said, oh, Karina, you're just being all hyper-vigilant about that microaggression stuff. She's a social worker. And I go, no, Carrie, she's giving us a stink eye. And she said, nah. So I set myself up right in front of this lady's lodge because I was worried and I felt protective of our camp. And sure enough, that's what we woke up to in the morning. This is what she hung up in her campground the next morning. I said, see, I told you so. So needless to say, we moved camp. There is something critical about walking in the footsteps of your ancestors that I want to share, which is we couldn't stay in the drama or the tears all that time. And it dawned on us that in that historical trauma event that our ancestors survived, they didn't either. That laughter is our medicine. And then we started looking at information. We said people made babies on the trail. That's actually important to know, right? Because part of historical trauma stuff and PTSD and other things, you get stuck in that trauma way of only focusing on all the horrible. But we actually played stickball. We found out we actually played stickball at some of these sites. Now, we also died, and it was horrific in parts. I mean, horrific. I'm talking about my ancestors, my direct ancestors I descend from. I found the story where they got lost around Lake Providence swamps, and they walked for 30 days in waist-high water. 30 days in waist-high water. I don't even know how you do that. That's documented. And they carried their babies who had passed, and the elders who passed, because they wouldn't leave them there. For 30 days, they walked that way, in and out of waist-high water. Okay, so that happened. And we still found love, and we still found ways to live as a people. So when we got to that one place where that indentation was, you know what we did? We laughed. The Choctaws laughed. You know what our indigenous allies who were there with us? They cried. They're like, what's wrong with you people? And we said, we connected to what we felt the spirits, that our ancestors felt, because we had just done the long prairie walk to get there. There's no shelter. And during that one walk that they did, it was blizzard conditions. People froze to death along the way. There was absolutely no shelter. So when we got to this place, we saw shelter and saw trees. Our spirits got so happy and overjoyed, we realized we connected to our ancestors' happiness at finally being at a place that they can take some respite. Meanwhile, other people were crying because all they could see was the indentation. That's why it's important to do this work. You see a different perspective when you're actually there. So some of the things that we learned in this process, and I want to just share this one story and then I need to wrap up, is there are stories that came out and ways of looking at things that wouldn't have happened had we not done this together. And a good example is both myself and Michelle, I was a therapist, we were both clinicians. And we never really talked about Choctaw notions of trauma and PTSD and stuff until we started having a conversation while we're out on the trail, and we started talking about, hey, did your mom ever call, Michelle, and she'd be standing right there, because you'd be on the playground playing, and they're calling for you, they're calling your spirit back. And we started sharing that story, and that's because what we believe is that your Shalombush is your spirit, that part of you that gets excited. It's that excitable, that energy that you carry. And your Shalombush, when it gets too excited, either from fear or from happiness, it can jump out. And when it jumps out, it's like dancing. Woo! It's in that spot. And it holds the memory of that place. It holds the memory of that moment until you call it back. It can stay there. Now, if it stays there, then you're only left with your shilluk. And your shilluk is that part of you, that spirit, that helps you get dressed, helps you eat, helps you do what you're supposed to, basic living. But it's not that energy. So these two things need to be combined to be whole. And then we had an aha moment that our ancestors already understood PTSD. That flashbacks, that disembodiment, disassociation is your Shalombush that jumps out of you. It holds the memory of that place, and it's important to call it back, because otherwise you're a shell of yourself walking around. We already understood that. And we also have a story that Nalusa Falaya, the soul eater, can come in if you're only walking around with your shilluk. The soul eater is literally the name of that soul eater, the darkness that can come in and eat you. So those are the things that started to emerge from the trail that was critical in thinking about how to create a model. I'm just going to go on to say that we did this twice. We ended up developing a model. We worked on making this a Choctaw-specific piece for Native women. And what we did is we said, this isn't about substance abuse and obesity prevention so much as it's about creating Choctaw health leaders. That we realized out of this experience is that we needed to do a Choctaw health promotion model. We need to create 150 Choctaw women leaders, 30 from each of the districts over 5 years, that will start with themselves and be trained in the model that did emerge from our work. I'm just going to fast forward it so to give you an idea. So this is the model that ended up emerging from our work that we decided to bring back, looking at our historical clan systems and what are the teachings that each of our clan systems had in their roles and responsibilities, and that becomes the guide for the curriculum that we developed for the women. They start with themselves, working on certain aspects behaviorally, but then they move up to becoming community organizers and creating events at the community level. So women are stepping into their roles as Choctaw women. It's not about obesity prevention, it's about stepping into your roles as Choctaw women and beginning with your health and then helping to build the health of others, so that by the end, what we hope to have is, for example, if there was, let's say, a substance abuse overdose in a particular community, the women who say, I am part of the White Crane Society, this is what we're kind of developing, they can call all the other White Crane women in the nation who have participated in this to come forward to help with the community prevention event, because that's what they've committed to as Choctaw women. Okay? And the three elements that are guiding questions is, what kind of ancestor did my ancestors envision me to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to be? And what kind of ancestor do I want or envision future generations to be? So this is what we've been doing. We're in our 5th year. We're in our 4th year right now. We're about to start going to our 5th year. And this, I can't show you faces, but this is a group of our first women that went through. And this is us crossing into Oklahoma and coming home. And it's been really amazing. And the one thing that's come out for overall, everyone says it's transformative. It shifts their thinking, how they understand their thinking. And one woman said, I'm off the pity party. After being on the trail and being in the steps of my ancestors, I'm off the pity party. So I'd like to close with a story to wrap this up. And long time ago, wake you up. You're just getting lulled now. All right, long time ago, back when human beings and animals, we still shared a language, a common language. We understood each other. There was human beings, animals, insects, all of us. We were in cocoons, and the world was dark. And one day, we finally came out of our cocoons. And we started walking around. But once in a while, we'd bump into each other. Hey, I can walk. Okay, I'm going over here. So we bump into each other. And all the animals and human beings, we all said, hey, you know, look, we got to stop bumping into each other. It's so dark. What can we do to bring some light? We need some light. We need fire or something. We've heard about this fire. And some of the animals said, oh, but that fire, it's all the way in the west, and it's guarded by these people who are, you know, they're pretty rough. We're a little scared of them. And they said, well, we need to go get it. Maybe we can go steal that fire and bring it back so we can have some light. And so they said, well, who of you are willing to do that? So Grandmother Spider, she stood up and she said, I could do it, I could do it, I could do it. And they're like, Grandma, who can do it? Well, guess who did? Possum. Possum stood up first, said, I can do it. I should be the one to do it because possums are beautiful. We have a gorgeous furry tail, and I have a plan. I'm going to walk over there, and I'm going to grab it with my tail and carry it home that way. And they said, okay, go ahead, try that, Possum. So Possum went. And what did Possum do? He grabbed that beautiful little umber by his tail and you know about Possum. Now you know what happened to Possum. Yeah. That's how Possum got his tail. So next we had Crow. Now Crow was a beautiful white bird in ancient days. Had a gorgeous singing voice. Crow, she was pretty proud of that. Crow said, you animal people, you can't do it. It's the bird people that can do this. Meanwhile, Grandmother Spider's like, I can help. They're like, Grandma Spider, you're too little. Who can really do this? Crow said, I can. I'm going to go over and I'm clever. I can figure this out. I'm going to go over, I'll fly over that fire, and I'm going to sing them a song, and I'm going to lull them, and I'm going to steal it and bring it back. And they said, go ahead, Crow. So Crow went over there, and there's Crow over that fire, and she's sitting there thinking, now what beautiful song can I sing? Because I'm pretty clever here. I can figure this out. Let me see. Let me think about it. What song? And poor Crow. That's how she changed color. So now you know what happened to Crow. Well, Buzzard said, oh, you guys just you're going about it the wrong way. You can't go from the ground like that, and you can't hover over the fire. Obviously, look what happened to poor Crow. I know what we'll do. I'm going to dive bomb it. I can go almost as high as Eagle, not quite that high, but I am going to dive bomb it because I've got my feathers on my hair that will get it, and I'll bring it home. They said, go ahead. You know what happened to Buzzard. Meanwhile, Grandmother Spider was all the time saying, listen, I can help. So by then, people were getting desperate. And they said, okay, Grandmother Spider, what can you do? Go ahead, give it a shot. So you know what she did? She prayed. She got up and she said her prayers. She sang her song to the fire. She got down and she took a little bit of earth and she made a little tiny clay pot. She put it on her back. And she threw her beautiful web, and she started crawling on her web, and she sang her song all the way to the fire. She talked to the fire, asking permission for the right to take it, to be with the people, to help us. She sang all the way, and she took a little tiny ember, put it in her pot, and came and brought it all the way back. And that's how fire came back, how fire came to us. And when she brought it, the people were stunned. They were so overwhelmed. They said, how did you do that? And she said, well, I'll teach you. And she said, but I can't be the one responsible for fire. Fire is medicine. Fire has, just like all medicine, has two faces. So who's going to take the responsibility to care for this fire, to learn the protocols, to learn how to use it in a beautiful way so that the people could live? Because as long as we have this fire, we will live. And that was the first time human beings spoke. We were humbled in. That was the first time a human being said, we will. We'll take it, Grandmother Spider. So that's why we, are supposed to carve a little image of her in our pottery to always remind us of that sacred responsibility, that we accepted that medicine so that others could live. So that's the story. So how are we Grandmother Spider? Sometimes we feel like that little person who's a social worker, we could do it. What are our responsibilities to keep that fire burning in our children, in our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? Because we have the power, we have that love, we have that vision. It's not just inherited, but we actually have. It's that incredible place of power. So what kind of ancestor am I going to be today? What kind of ancestor are you going to be today by the actions that we take? It's a place of beautiful power and love and vision. And I just want to close with a quote from Tecumseh for Carl. Because, Mr. Scott, because Tecumseh came to the Alabama Choctaws, and Pushmataha was one of the chief here, and so was Nita Ketche, and a couple of others who were very strong leaders here. And there was a group of Choctaws that ended up in Alabama, in part because they liked what Tecumseh said, and they wanted to follow him. And Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader who wanted to unite Native people and said, for us to deal with what's happening, we need to unite as a people. We need to come together even though we have these differences. And our group of Alabama Choctaw said, we'd like to do that. And Pushmataha said, you do that, you're forever going to leave. We're not recognizing you as Choctaw. So there was a group that said, fine. And they came down here to Alabama. So Tecumseh said, this is his quote, and I want you to take this today as we move forward and we light that fire, and we continue that fire in our lives. So live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart. Trouble no one about their religion. Respect others in their view, and demand that they respect yours. Love your life. Perfect your life. Beautify all things in your life. Show respect to all people, but grovel to none. Seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the Great Divide. But we must be united. We must smoke the same pipe. We must fight each other's battles. And more than all, we must love the Great Spirit. Yakoke, thank you.
No, I want you to come with me. Okay. I told you she was bad. She's bad. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful, wonderful presentation and such an important one, addressing historical trauma and putting it in the context of all the ways that it manifests itself, and sharing with us your own personal story around walking the Trail of Tears. That was very, very powerful. So I thank you again, Katrina. I'm without words, and I'm usually not without words. But at this time, I'd like to present you with this plaque that reads, "In recognition of Karina L. Walters, PhD, 2018 Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecture, continuing Carl A. Scott's legacy of equity and justice in social work."
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're so honored.
Thank you. You are.
You're awesome. I am.
Yeah. All right. I don't know if they may want to do a picture of the two of us. At this time, we bring our lecture to a conclusion, and thank you all very, very much for attending.
For a coffee, I'm at the side of social work.
And Katrina will be available at the University of Washington's booth for coffee and further dialogue with anyone if you'd like to stop by and have an opportunity to share some of your thoughts and ask questions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay.